Now it's recording.
All right. Finally, we've gotten through our technological difficulties, and we are starting. For those who don't know me, I'm Ken Loshine. I'm a professor in the history department, and this talk is on swordswomen, on women and the queen of weapons, the so-called queen of weapons. Thank you for bearing with us through all of our technical difficulty. And usually technology makes things easier, but very frequently it makes things much more difficult. But of course, there's no technology quite as simple as cold steel. It just makes things easier, it cuts through them. But of course, for me to be able to show you all these nifty pictures, I need my PowerPoint. And of course, in order to have the proper formatting of the actual PowerPoint slide presentation, I actually need to have fonts. So here we are. We've got it going through my laptop on the screen. This, of course, is Rivera's Duel de Mujeres, Duel of Women. I'll be talking about that. I'll be talking about a number of things. Actually, let me tell you exactly what I'm going to be talking about today. The medieval world, the early modern world, was a world where enfranchisement, where political authority, political right, amounted to bearing arms, to keeping and bearing and having arms. So the question then is, what is the place of women? Women are not supposed to be weapons bearers. Women are not supposed to have weapons, to carry weapons, supposedly. But women, nonetheless, either by virtue of their birth, by virtue of circumstance, or by virtue of legalities, were thrust into situations where they were required to use weapons. And some evidently took recourse to arms because they had a penchant for it, because they chose the life of arms, which would have been something that would have been terribly odd and terribly weird to the pre-modern mind, something against the natural order of things. What I'm going to talk about today is about some of these circumstances, about what they are. And I'm going to talk about how these things transformed in the early modern era and into the modern era. And I'm going to identify a few paradigms as we do this. The first one, of course, is woman as military leader. I'm going to talk to you about women, especially in the Middle Ages, who, because they were born into a certain estate, they were born into a certain social class, were expected to take their place as military leaders. And some maneuvered in order to keep those places, in fact, because that was at the top of the food chain. I'm also going to talk to you about women as legitimate individual combatants, not necessarily in the military context, but women who took part in either real or imagined, and a lot of these were imaginary, rather in the realm of fiction or even of legal speculation. Women who took part in duels. Women who were the paradigm of women as duelists. The women as skilled combatant. Women as somebody who has to defend their rights in armed conflict, not necessarily in the military context. And I'm going to talk also about woman as outlaw. The idea of the armed woman as a renegade, the armed woman as somebody who is going against social norms, going against what's expected, in other words, as a criminal. And we're going to see a transformation as time goes on from the women having, by virtue of the medieval legal system, actually having the right to take her place as a leader of armed troops, as somebody who could take part in conflict, into the more outre examples of this, even as it was lauded in fiction. And I think what we're going to see also is that this is going to become fetishized, that this is going to be an oddity, this is going to be something of the virago of the armed woman, that instead of something admirable, that we're going to see the armed woman as almost a monster. And this is eventually going to play into things that we see today in pop culture, right? Game of Thrones notably amongst it. All those scantily clad women in armor bikinis that you see in video games, Where does this paradigm come from? Well, actually, it has a long history in history and in literature, and it's a particularly appealing trope, I think, because it has something of the transgressive about it. And related to this, though somewhat outside it, is woman is fencer. Right? So these are not mutually exclusive, and they've changed over time. But also, outside of this, we're going to have this sort of fourth category outside the margins, which is woman as fencer. Woman as athlete. Woman as not necessarily taking part in life or death conflict, or woman not necessarily as criminal or brawler, but woman as sportswoman. And this is affected by all these tropes, but it's still somewhat outside of it, because the realm of sport, of course, is not the realm of deadly conflict. It's not the realm of the military, it's not even the realm of the duel, though they are, of course, related. So to this, we need to add this fourth paradigm, woman as fencer, woman as athlete. Of course, there's literature on women and violence. There's a lot of literature on violence, and there's a lot of literature on where women fit into this. And overall, the people agree, the leading authorities agree, that women were not involved in violence, or they certainly weren't involved in armed conflict. That rather, women who are called into court for armed affrays, they tended to use what was near at hand: pots, pans. In one notable instance, a German housewife assaulted a man with a chicken. Whether the chicken was alive or dead at the time was not revealed in the court documents. So we don't see women, though, taking to the streets, women really taking part in brawls. If anything's near at hand, it's usually a utility knife. That is, anything near at hand in the form of what we recognize as a weapon. What we do see women taking part in, and this is very much emphasized in the sources, is public shaming, gathering outside your house, singing rude songs about you, smearing excrement on your door. This we find in a lot of the sources. This, of course, it serves to emphasize perhaps a difference, at least in this literature, in this historiography, between men as fighters, men as armed, men as combatants. But the idea that a woman should be taking part in armed conflict, women should be brawling, this is seen as something perhaps too outside the pale. And it doesn't occur. But if we turn back the page, right, a lot of these sources, a lot of what people are looking at here, are really late medieval, early modern court records, especially from cities, and it's a very limited slice of sources. If we start expanding the sort of sources that we look at, we start seeing a very different picture. Why is this so odd? Well, the sword, and this, it's a masculine symbol, right? The sword is a symbol of masculinity. It's obviously a phallic symbol. And it's the place of the chevalier, right, male noun, his place in the world to fight. Women's identity, it seemed, came more through marriage. The purpose of men is to fight, if that's their place in society. If not, it's to work. Women's identity comes through marriage, right? A woman is a maiden, and then she's a mother. On the other hand, if we look closer at the symbology of the sword, really what the sword symbolizes in the chivalric literature is the administration of justice. And so the sword is not necessarily the sole province of men, because, well, women can be involved in administering justice too. Women of the noble class, if there are no near male relatives, well, then they're the ones in charge. They're the ones in authority. And in fact, there are a number of circumstances in the pre-modern world in which women can legitimately fight. And what we're going to talk about is some women who took arms in their own right, and then, as these modern gender regimes begin to take shape, we'll move on to some of the more strange figures, the more outre figures of the early modern and then the modern eras. So first thing, let's just look at some of the legacy of Christian antiquity. This is an illustration, a reproduction illustration from Psychomachia of Prudentius. Right? Here we see fighting women, but not real fighting women. These are the virtues. The virtues are seen, are incarnated in the form of women. Here we have chastity fighting against lust. Lust is equipped with 3 flaming torches, but chastity is armored. She's got her shield. She's got her armor, and she defeats lust. She puts out lust's torches. Right here, we see a Christian virtue personified as a woman and actually fighting. Not really, but at least thought of it that way, right? And this, of course, is going to be a very long tradition of fighting women in literature. So there's no problem in this with women as allegory. Here, of course, we have patience, fighting anger, crazy woman, wild hair. She strikes patience and her sword breaks. She's so eager for the victory, and her sword breaks, and she's defeated. There we have faith against doubt, withstanding her and tying her up. Right? Great stuff. Really, it's psychomachia, but you have to wonder what's going on psychologically in Prudentius's head as he's coming up with all this stuff, personifying the virtues as female and going after and destroying these vices. But of course, this is not reality in any way, shape, or form. It's an idealized combat. And don't forget that the idea of the fighting woman is going to be a powerful idea right along the actuality of fighting women. But in late antiquity, the early Middle Ages, we don't get a lot of references to fighting women. We do get some in Viking Sagas. The Norse people, of course, were primarily oral people. They had oral stories that they handed down, and some of these included, because these were for entertainment as well as histories. And by the time these were written down, usually in the 13th century, they had figures of female fighters that were well established. Most famous, of course, is Brunhilde in the Volsung Saga, which, of course, Wagner later famously made into the ring cycle. And everyone knows the image of Brunhilde, the Valkyrie, played, of course, by Bugs Bunny in What's Opera Doc. And there are 3 women in the Gesta Danorum, which was written by Saxo Grammaticus, who's considered very believable because, of course, he wrote in Latin. So they do crop up now and again in Norse legends. And we also have Viking graves, Norse graves, I should say, I think it's a culture its proper term, in which women are buried with weapons. Why are women buried with weapons? It is a symbol of authority with a woman of high rank. And there's one reference also in the Icelandic War, where it's theoretically possible for a woman to prosecute a feud, to follow through with a family feud. If all the men in her family have been killed, there are no more men left to carry on this feud, then a woman can even carry it on. So at least Norse culture was at least somewhat open to the idea of warrior women. But this was not so for the Germanic people that took over the majority of what had been the Roman Empire. In fact, one people, the Lombards, in their law, they forbid a woman from carrying weapons or having any part in quarrels, right? Even if she's attacked, she has to get a man to defend her. And it's notably anti-feminist, that women are more victory markers, women are prizes. Aha, I've conquered you, I'm going to carry your daughter off and marry her, and you're going to cling to your lands. And it's really, we don't really start seeing historical women, as opposed to things like sagas, which sort of skirt the edge between fiction and history, which is always sort of a thin line, but they really skirt those. But we don't really start getting historical women taking part in armed violent conflict until the big shifts in society after the 9th and 11th centuries. And there's some big social shifts that occur in this era. What are these? What are these social shifts? Well, to begin with, the church gets involved. This is the era of the Gregorian reforms. The church really begins, is really one of the factors that leads to a big social shift in the 11th century, right? Turn of the year 1000 and after. They make marriage a sacrament, for starters. This means that the church gets to administer marriage and says who is married and who is not. And together with this, they say, hey, you can only have one wife. That it's not, go conquer a guy and then maybe take his daughter to wife and then maybe take someone else's daughter to wife, which you see, Charlemagne had many concubines. You see this with the earlier Franks, particularly. But they forbid this. You can only have one wife. You can't divorce her. And the importance of consent to marriage, that together with what makes marriage valid is that the man and the woman both have to consent to this, which is ultimately, of course, why none of you guys are expecting your parents to arrange marriages for you, right? That we're all expecting to go out and find our mates on our own, that we don't have sort of arranged marriages as in really most other cultures. Why did the church do this? Well, there's a big argument, David Hurley made this argument, that the church is controlling marriage, but also, well, what if your wife's infertile and you're not going to have any kids? Well, you can't divorce her, you can't get another wife, but you're more likely, if you're not going to die without heirs, to leave your property to the church. But the result is that women are more valued. Women become, in a word, less disposable in society. Women are beginning to be in positions of authority by virtue of whom they've married, and then if they're widowed, they maintain that authority, and also by whom they've, also by whom they're the daughter of. Together with these religious changes, there are also secular changes. That there's a change to single inheritance as opposed to multiple inheritance. This takes place really in the 950s, even before these Gregorian reforms. And we begin to see the importance of lineages, of noble lineages. There's a single bed. In medieval castle, really, there's one bed, and we're talking here really about, wooden shacks. We don't even have proper castles really yet, or not very many of them anyway. But there's one bed for the lord and the lady to procreate and to make the heir. You're expecting to have one heir, as opposed to, as the Franks had, splitting up your lands amongst different all your children, which of course made it harder to keep together enough land to live on. And what if your only surviving child is a daughter? Well, this will come to the fore in a moment. We see a shift to dowry also as opposed to bride price. That instead of a man giving a woman's father money, hey, here's some cattle and some land and some sheep, give me your daughter, right? Instead, the woman is given property that she brings with her into marriage. In other words, women are controlling property. And as great church historian James Bunter said, as soon as women could control property, they became objects of reverence, which is to say objects of authority. In other words, in short, the place of women, by all these societal reforms, which are all related to the consolidation of medieval society and the growth of a stable medieval society in the years following the recovery from the Carolingian collapse, then women begin, part of it is that women begin to have authority. Women begin to have power. Women begin to have a more valuable place in society. And I'm not saying that these gender roles I was discussing before, they completely flew away, or that they're not there anymore, there aren't gender expectations, but simply that women who controlled property also had with this authority, because land, of course, is power in the Middle Ages. And there, of course, we can see this also to explain the image. Not coincidentally, we see with this the growing cult of the Virgin Mary. So one woman who controlled vast property and was certainly in the military commander was Matilda of Tuscany. Who was she? Well, she's the daughter of Beatrice of Lorraine, who was herself well known because she harassed the troops of the Holy Roman Emperor as they tried to go through the passes of the Apennines, the passage to reach Rome. Why was the Holy Roman Emperor? Well, who was the Holy Roman Emperor? The Holy Roman Emperor was actually the overlord of what's now Germany. He's neither holy nor Roman nor an emperor, to paraphrase Voltaire. But he does need to go down to Rome to get crowned, to get his authority, which ultimately derives from Charlemagne's being crowned, quote-unquote, Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day of the year 800. And he needs to go down, he needs to get himself crowned. And the Holy Roman Emperors are always interfering with Italian politics, and they're also going to be butting heads with the Pope. More on that in a moment. So her mom had this long history of interfering, and she herself has this, meaning Matilda, has a long history of this. She's the last heir of the House of Canossa. You may have heard Canossa before. That is the castle where Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor, had to do penance, kneeling for 3 days, supposedly, outside in the snow, because he pissed off the Pope. This is Pope Gregory VII, the guy who led these Gregorian reforms. And the subject of all this was something called the Investiture Controversy, which, to really simplify it, was that, no, even though you are the Holy Roman Emperor, if some bishopric or abbey is vacant in your lands, you can't fill it, you can't sell church offices, that what belongs to the church belongs to the church, and you, the secular power, have no power over it, and you can't, and people can't sell church offices, and that if you have a position in the church, you have to administer it impartially, which of course is one reason why we have this idea that if you have a government post or a government or a corporate job, for instance, that you should administer that impartially, which is of course why we all receive conflict of interest training. Conflict of interest wasn't a big deal in the Middle Ages. They thought, of course, I've got this position, I'm going to administer it for everyone's good. It was the church that first said, no, you gotta you've got to administer your public office or your church office impartially. So, Matilda, though, does not like the emperor. She doesn't want that. She wants independence. She doesn't want anyone telling her what to do. She rejects the emperor. And she does every conniving scheme she can imagine to keep this and to get and keep power. So, first, one thing, she has her husband, Godfrey the Hunchback, murdered in 1076. Or at least it's thought that she had him murdered, that the assassin hid in a privy, and, well, you can imagine where he put the sword when Godfrey went to relieve himself. So she's a widow at a young age in 1076, and she sides against Henry IV. She says, no, Emperor, stay the hell out of Italy. She goes so far as to marry Welf V, heir of Bavaria, to form a political alliance against the emperor. He was 15, she was 42. He was never quite able to consummate the marriage, the poor kid, even when she had herself born to him naked on a table with a bunch of knights saying, "There's no place to hide now, kid. You got to do what you got to do." And he runs away screaming, and she curses him, and they have the marriage annulled. You got to really feel for Welf V, poor kid. But nonetheless, despite his disaster in that respect, the name of Welf becomes synonymous with the papal party in Italian politics. Of course, if you've read Dante is a white Welf. Those politics are very complicated. The thing is, we're talking about Matilda as a military leader. Well, Matilda ruled a huge chunk of northern Italy until she died in 1115. And she fought 2 wars with Henry IV. And we can't find any military commanders. And the image of her, she commanded troops in her own right. And she was a military force. And don't forget that in the Middle Ages, military commanders led from the front. We have no record of any men leading her troops for her, and her biographers really make it seem as if she was the one doing the leading too. Did she wear armor? Well, we don't think she took part in the fighting, but she was at least someone who wielded military authority by virtue of her social position. Another example is Gator of Salerno. Who is Gator? Well, she was the wife of Robert Guiscard. Who's Robert Guiscard? He was a Norman. He was from Normandy, the same place where William the Conqueror came from, except he decided, instead of conquering cold, foggy, rainy England, he said, I'm going to go conquer Naples and Sicily. A far better place to conquer, if you ask me. And the thing is, you go and you conquer someplace, well, you're not going to just completely replace everybody there, right? You're not going to just, move the population. No, you're going to marry into them. And he married Gator, who was a member of the native nobility. And when he wasn't around, because he was off conquering or doing whatnot, well, she was the one who was in charge. She held castles. She withstood sieges. She prevented men from fleeing in battle. And, of course, she's also important because, well, the Normans who went and conquered Naples and Sicily are really, really outnumbered. He needs her because her troops are looking to her, right? His authority for leading a lot of his troops derives from his wife. So, and for some reason I still have Matilda as the image for this. So, in the following generation is the generation of the Crusades. And we have a lot of information, or not a lot of information, but at least some references of women participating in the Crusades scattered here and there in the Chronicles. Because we do have, chroniclers are biased. Chroniclers are not, they're going to concentrate on the doings of the great lords and not going to concentrate on the foot soldiers. And they're going to concentrate on the men and not on the women. But some, for instance, the Norman Anonymous Chronicle, mention the part that women played. For instance, women were support troops. Women did the logistics work. The Turks were surrounding us on all sides, throwing darts and casting javelins and shooting arrows from a surprisingly long distance. Our women were a great help to us that day, since they kept bringing water for embalmment and bravely comforting them as they resisted. But not just that, women may have actually taken part in the actual fighting. Women, of course, followed the army, right? They were washerwomen, they were cooks, they deloused the men, right? Not just the Middle Ages, that personal hygiene wasn't great, you wanted to take the lice out. But nonetheless, they were still killed in action, and they still did dangerous jobs, like digging siege works. And when you're besieging a town or a city, then you have to dig trenches and things like that. You're exposed to enemy fire, and a lot of them were killed. And in fact, in Muslim accounts, if you look at Muslim accounts of the Crusades, then the Muslims actually mention warrior women amongst, or at least combatant women, amongst the Franks, amongst the Crusaders, a lot more than the Western accounts do. And this is maybe a device to shame them. Oh, look, they don't have proper gender roles, right? Even their women fight. But usually this seems pretty believable. This is happening when when the Christians are being attacked. That they attack a Christian camp and a woman picks up a bow and starts plinking off Turks. And afterwards they bring the bow to Saladin, and he is favorably impressed with this bow. So if you're attacked, right, your camp is attacked, well, you're not just going to sit there. You're going to pick up a bow, especially, and you're going to fight. And of course, here's Eleanor of Aquitaine, very notable as a crusading woman. And in fact, we have accounts of her when she's rallying the troops, when she's going before Bernard of Clairvaux, the holy man who called for a second crusade to go relieve the poor besieged crusaders in Jerusalem. Well, he describes her and her ladies as just like Amazons, as wearing armor, right, riding horses. Not that they actually took part in the fighting, but this may have been, if this really happened, may have been a rhetorical device. And she's another example of a woman who, by virtue of her family position, wielded authority and military power on her own. Why? Because even though she's married to the King of France, Louis VII, I believe it was, the troops that are following her because of who she is. She's the daughter of William of Aquitaine. He's a duke, and he is one of the most powerful men that in what was then France. And so she is owed loyalty in her own right. She is a leader of military troops. But the Crusades were unusual in that they were offensive wars, right? The Crusades were wars, essentially wars to take land. Most warfare is what we call Fetishization warfare, and it revolves around castles. Castles were how you held land in the Middle Ages. That a castle controls territory. And if you're attacked, well, you can hold up your castle and they can't get to you. And then when they have to either spend time besieging you, or if they decide to pass you by, you can go hit them in the rear. Castles were key to holding and controlling land in the Middle Ages. And in the defense of castles, much like Gator, women would fight. Women fight in defense of their castle or of their town. And this is actually consonant even with traditional gender roles. They're fighting to defend what is essentially a sort of home, right? A castle is a home. It's a residence. An example, a great example, is Nicola de la Haye. She was Sheriff of Lincolnshire, which meant that she actually had a position of authority, and she defends Lincoln Castle against sieges during some of the English civil wars in the 12th and early 13th centuries. There were even chivalric orders that included women. The Order of the Hasha, the Axe, was instituted in 1149 by the Count of Barcelona to honor the women of Tortosa, which is in Catalonia, who helped to fight off the Moors in the siege. women were also in the Order of Santiago, and as well as the Order of the Glorious Saint Mary, which was later suppressed in the 15th century. So there were actually orders of knights that admitted women. Whether or not they fought, or it was more of an honorary position, I won't comment. In short, as our good friend of mine, Valerie Eads, has commented, a husband was able to go on a crusade only because he knew his wife was able to defend the castle. And later on, of course, this idea of women defending castle even became a grand part of the more pageant-like terms of the 15th century. The idea of assaulting the castle of ladies figures a lot in romances, and of course it makes a wonderful metaphor for assailing chastity, right? Because who wants that? But there are accounts of women even as offensive combatants. A great example, one of the more famous examples, is mentioned by the Italian humanist Petrarch. He writes a letter in quite elegant Latin to Cardinal Giovanni Colonna about a woman he meets south of Naples, named in a town of Pozzuoli, which is why this woman has become known as Maria of Pozzuoli. He describes her as a warrior woman. She's stronger than any man. She goes around, she's tremendously skilled at war, she rides horses, she engages in hand-to-hand combat, she doesn't mention her engaging in hand-to-hand combat, but she leads raids, she's tactically very, very skilled, and he mentions that she has incredible strength, she can throw rocks and iron bars further than any man, and he just remarks upon her. He doesn't mention who she was fighting, but at the time the Aragonese were attacking the kingdom of Naples, so she was probably fighting the Spanish. Another example, a famous example, mentioned by another chronicler, in this case Froissart, who was a great chronicler of the 100 Years' War between England and France. To give you a very brief explanation of the 100 Years' War, it was a multi-generational conflict over whether the King of England was also going to be the King of France, and it's going to come up again when we talk about Joan of Arc. But one of the earlier parts of this was something called the War of Breton Succession over who gets the Duchy of Brittany. And Jeanne de Dampierre was the wife of John of Montfort, one of the contenders for the duchy, and as well as a countess, and she became known as Burnin' Joan because during the siege of her castle of Hennebon, she actually led a sortie out and burned the enemy camp, and she wore armor and wielded a sword. And then later, shortly thereafter, she was in a sea battle, and Froissart describes her standing on the prow of her ship, wearing armor, fighting, and wielding a glaive, which is a sword in Old French. It means basically a sword in Old French. Glaive. So she's someone who, because her husband was around, put on armor, grabbed the sword, and went at it, because she had to. Less substantiated, and this is sort of a folk legend, is the Arms of the Dudleys of England. Supposedly, there was a woman named Agnes Hota, who later married into the Dudley clan, which is why they have that, who her father was going to fight a judicial duel in the 1370s, supposedly, and he was sick, and she took arms and then beat the man. And of course, it's a trope, right, that the woman beats the man, and then she opens her shirt and shows him her bosom, right? You've been beaten by a woman. It's a proof of femininity. But keep an eye on that trope, because that trope is going to come up again and again. That's why I included it. One of the earlier mentions of that bearing your chest trope that I've found. So keep your mind on it. Anyway, I don't personally think I've never found any actual documentation backing this up. In any case, probably in England in the 14th century, such a matter would have been decided in court, not by judicial duel. Now, Joan of Arc bears special mention here. We all like to talk about Joan of Arc, right? Warrior woman, but not for the reasons that you might think about. Because she, if anything, I think, her example serves to show just how exceptional these women going and taking military command and fighting was. Because she's sort of the negative example. What did she do? Well, she was born in 1412, and by that point, the 100 Years' War, not going very well for the French. There we have a map of what the English had and what the French had. The English, after the Battle of Agincourt, had essentially control over all of northern France. There were Burgundians. Here's Burgundy, right? The Great Duchy of Burgundy. Here's Brittany. We're told about Brittany. Well, that's British now. Burgundy, here's where the Burgundians are. The Great Duke of Burgundy is now allowed to be English. They have control of Flanders. They've got control of a lot of this. And poor Charles VIII is hiding out down in the Loire Valley. He's hiding out down where, in his castle. He can't travel to, I believe it was Amiens, to be actually courtier, to actually take the crown. So he's still the Dauphin. When the angels speak to Joan and say, "Hey, Joan, go to Chuck and tell him to go get himself crowned and beat back the English." And she does, and she inspires the French. Every rational strategy having failed, they're like, "Hey, let's follow this peasant girl. Great idea." Put her in armor. They go raise the siege of Orleans, and the rest is history. Of course, things do not end very happily for Joan, because she's captured by those perfidious Burgundians in 1430, and a couple of years later, she is executed by the English. And of course, what's she executed for? She's executed for witchcraft. How do we know she's a witch? Because she weighs as much as a duck. No, we know that she was a witch because she cross-dresses, because she was wearing armor. And this is transgressive, right? She's some peasant girl. She has no business wearing armor. She's not some lord's wife who's holding the fort while he's away. No, she's usurping her place. This sort of charge made eminent sense. Obviously, it's political, right? They don't like her, but she's not really. If it had been a noble prisoner, they obviously would have accorded him or her a bit of grace, right, and a bit more accord. But not poor Joan. Poor Joan. She's accused of being a witch because of her cross-dressing, same as sorcery. And there's a long history of witches being sort of gender line crossers too, that we can get into, but we won't because we don't have time. And she is, unfortunately, burned to death in the marketplace in Rouen, where there's now a very sad-looking farmer's market. Poor Joan. Moving on. So clearly, something had happened between Eleanor's time and Joan, right? Hierarchy and legitimacy had become established by tradition, and women might not be in authority because of their blood anymore. But warfare is not the only sort of fighting that you might come up with in the Middle Ages, because there's also the idea of judicial duel. And women have an ambiguous and conflicting place in this. What is a duel? We should talk about what a duel is before we get into this, before we talk about the changes in warfare in the late Middle Ages and the rise of dueling as the place for showing just how much of a man you are. Well, we have this idea that, you have insulted my honor, smack, smack, my seconds will call upon you. But a duel is actually a sort of combat by ordeal. There's a hidden truth. There's something that we can't know. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. Well, we can't tell. There's no witnesses. You have to fight it out. And the private, this is usually something like, for instance, the Carogue, the Greece duel of 1386 was actually over the honor of a woman. That these guys were political and economic rivals, but Carogue accused Legris of having raped his wife. There were no witnesses, and since there were no witnesses, there was nothing to do for it but fight it out. This was actually the last duel authorized by the law courts in France, or at least the Parliament of Paris, and so this is an example of that sort of hidden truth. Later on, right? This is actually a criminal matter. Later on, it became over points of honor, especially things like you lie, giving someone a lie. This is saying basically you have no face, you are not truthful, it's a sort of social death. And this was something that, these were fighting and killing words later on in the 16th century. But in the beginning it was for legal affairs. Which isn't to say that, female duelists weren't a possibility, even if we have this idea that dueling was, that men are the ones who represent themselves in court, and therefore women are covered. There's this old legal privilege of coverage that women are sort of subsumed into their husband legally. So it'd be the husband doing this, if say they're arguing over the wife's property or something. But in German law codes, right? We're talking here German law codes of the later Middle Ages, not the early Germanic law codes. Women had, in certain circumstances, particularly in unwitnessed cases of rape, they actually had recourses to duels. And there are two separate records of such combat actually taking place in 1288 in Bern, in which the women actually won. So, women might actually participate in these sorts of judicial duels, which of course were very different, again, from the Duel of Honor. We find in some of the sources dealing with personal combat, the Fechtbücher, some examples of what these were. And these were, perhaps fanciful. Don't forget that any book is constructed for a reason, and that these are constructed for a noble patron in order to show him, hey, these are the things I can show you, but also to delight him. And this is Hans Talhoffer's depiction of how such a duel would be fought. The man is in a hole, armed with a club. The woman is, they're both wearing these sort of leather gimp outfits, which are part of the get-up. She has her veil, and she has a rock in her veil, which she uses like a flail to try to bash him over the head, while he tries to drag, either hit her with the club or drag her into the hole. Here we see he's grabbed her, and she's sort of wrapped that flail around his neck. They're both bleeding, they're both hurt, but he just hit her with that club. Here are a couple of other illustrations from another one of Talhoffer's manuscripts. She's grabbed him by the rather painful parts and is pulling him out of the hole. But there, she's got him with the neck and he's hitting her with the club. Talhoffer is not the only one to show this. And Talhoffer shows how the woman might win. She shows also the man getting the better of the woman. But in the same tradition, a little later, Hollis Kahl also shows this. Slightly different. The man has a stick, not one of those nasty sharp clubs. And the woman is just wearing her chemise with her rock in her sleeve. But he sort of restores the gender norms because he has the man win, drag the woman into the hole, and she's done for. So, rather brutal, not nice, not very romantic, not the stuff of Hollywood, right? But did it happen? Probably, at least once or twice in history. But that's not the sort of thing we think of when we think about duels. We think about Renaissance courtiers and flashing rapiers and the Three Musketeers. And this stuff came about because of that duel of honor I mentioned before. You lie, no I don't, let's go fight it out. Why would you give somebody the lie? Because obviously you're rivals, because you've got some political goings on, there's other things, you've got other reasons for hard feelings. And the duel for point of honor actually became rather commonplace in the 16th and 17th century, and these were actually granted by rulers. You would go, you'd ask your local governor for the right to a field. You'd ask him for, hey, me and Bob, we got us a beef. Can we have, can we have a field someplace to go fight it out? And these would be big events. Later, of course, the Council of Trent, the Counter-Reformation Council, forbade this, and they became sort of more underground, but they continued unabated all the way really through the 17th century. And there was no shortage of literature on this, of showing how to train the male body, this is from Camillo Agrippa's treatise of 1553, for personal combat. Here Agrippa is looking specifically at the male body. He says the male body is, not specifically the male body, but by human, he means man, right? He means not women as duelists, but men as duelists. Well, the male body is like that forked branch there, a naturally perfect implement, and just as the forked implement can draw all sorts of geometrical shapes, so too can the male body do everything you need to fence. So he's thinking, even without saying so, in very gendered terms. It's man as the combatant. He's not saying men and women as combatants. It seems silly to bring up, but nonetheless, it's an important point to make. Why did this happen? Well, the reason why is because warfare was changing. Warfare became much more professionalized. Why was it? Because of gunpowder. That siege warfare I was talking about became obsolete once you had cannon that could suppress a fortress, which means that you begin to have large standing armies, that modern states came about in order to finance these armies, and warfare, in other words, was becoming professionalized. This is something we call the military revolution, which meant that if you wanted someplace to stand out for the masculine performance of violence, then you had, what you had left, you had the dueling field. This, of course, is the famous Châteauneuf-Jarnac duel in 1550s, which was led to the death of Henri II's favorite, the Châteauneuf by Jarnac, the famous coup de Jarnac, and that was the last time that official duel was sanctioned in France. So there you go. But of course, nonetheless, people began dueling, which brings us to our background image, the Duel de Mujeres. This is actually, even though Ribera painted in 1636, this is apparently something that happened with an actual combat that took place between two women in 1552. Why? It was over a man. And they took to the field, and the best information I can find on this is that they're actually armored as knights, which wasn't uncommon. And actually we find a lot of women fighting on horseback. Why? Because, well, just as a sword can be an equalizer in strength, well, horses are a really good equalizer in terms of strength, because women can ride horses as well as men, sometimes better, usually better these days, and the horses of force multiplier. You get hit by, a 100-pound woman, it's not going to hurt as much as if you get hit by 1,200 pounds of woman and horse. To give you 1,100 pounds is a good weight for a horse of that age, and they actually were granted a field for this by the Spanish viceroy. I mean, this was actually an officially sanctioned duel. And unlike in Ribera's painting, they were armed not with rapiers, but on horseback, as I mentioned. And this sort of became a cause célèbre. People began talking about this. We begin to see this idea, this unusualness, but we begin to see the sort of fetishization of the armed woman. And Ribera's painting has much of the idea of the trope of the combat of the virtues and vices, or of virtue against vice, which was a long-standing trope of illustrations and moral painting. So here we have virtue conquering vice, and this is almost 100 years after the act, like 80 years after the combat happened. Like clearly, this was something about this that resonated. I should mention also that yes, this happened in Naples, but why is this a Spanish painter? Well, because Naples was a Spanish possession at the time, and it was also incidentally Naples that introduced this idea of the code duello, which was originally a Spanish thing, to the Italian peninsula. And the Italians kind of picked it up and ran with it, and the French and the English and everyone kind of took it from the Italians. So this happened supposedly 1552. Another example of a woman with a sword, one who is perhaps even more transgressive, one who became even more of a cause célèbre, was Catalina de Erasua, the famous lieutenant nun. She was born 1585 to a Basque family. The Basques were not doing so well at this point. The consolidated Spain was impinging on their power. Her family may not have been doing so very well. This is the same milieu that St. Francis Xavier came from. His family castle was actually knocked down by the king. And she was sent, as many girls were, to a convent for her education. Because you really had two paths in life. You can get married or you can be a nun, right? Very traditional Catholic family. She said neither. She ran away, dressed as a man, and boarded a boat for New Spain, for the Spanish colonies in the New World. And she fought in the army. She fought in wars against the Indians. She served with distinction. In one case, she chased down on horseback a Native American chief, also on horseback, and captured him. And she was promoted to lieutenant for what she did. And she says, I mean, we know from her autobiography, she describes killing a lot of men in brawls, and she describes acting as a second in a duel. And very frequently, the seconds, sort of the guys who made sure the duels ran smoothly, well, they wound up fighting too, and it was dark, and later she found out, oh man, I just killed my own brother, who had actually been her commanding officer. This is all according to her autobiography, so it's a bit sensational. And so she does that, but what we do know about her, absolutely for certain, is that she became something of a celebrity, right? Her autobiography and a lot of these tales of daring do and fighting and brawling might be spurious because it was only really found in the late 18th century, published in the early 19th century. Is it a forgery? We don't know. But we do know that she was granted a dispensation to wear men's clothes by the Pope, that she was well known in Spain, that she received the royal pension, but she was poor when she died in 1650, but she was something of a celebrity. So again, we see this idea of the fighting woman, something rare, something to be pointed at, almost in a way monstrous, right? We have a portrait of her. I can't remember the artist's name. He was very well known though. But we have people who are not well known don't have people paint have their portraits painted. There's definitely something of the unusual about her, and of course people love novelty. Was she considered someone to emulate? I highly doubt it. Again, what we've seen here then is we've gone from woman, right? Woman is a legitimate combatant by virtue of her birth, to women taking part in the Monomachia, right? Women taking part in the duel by virtue of legality. And then from there, we've gone to woman as outlaw, woman as something outside the bounds, but something that perhaps that's fetishized. And to give you perhaps the best example of the sexy, exciting, yet transgressive woman, we'll have to go to late 17th and 18th century France. First, a little note on why these women became so celebrated, so well known. Why did Catalina de Rassou become well known? Well, the answer was, this is the age of print capitalism. We have the printing press, we have printers, we have people trying to publish bestsellers, right? Bloomsbury made quite a few pounds off Harry Potter, and people were no different back in the 17th century. They're trying to make a buck off print capitalism, and sensational stories of fighting women, just like any other sort of monster, is going to sell copy. Here we have the duel between two sisters. One has a sling and one has a rope. French broadside from about 1650, and this is, why did people make woodcuts like this? Because they sold. And why did people write this into literature? There's no shortage in literature of warrior women, right? Again, we go back to this idea of fighting women as a literary trope, right? And whereas it actually happening in real life might be somewhat monstrous and strange, then we also have the sort of idealized one. We have Bradamante in Orlando Furioso, a warrior woman who no one could withstand. She's the mightiest, she's the best fighter there, and she's, crazy mad in love with Ruggiero. And of course we have Clarinda in Tasso's Jerusalem Liberata, which is actually Monteverdi actually writes a piece, I think, for Three Voices on this in 1624. And this is quite famous in the subject of art. There, of course, we have, what is this, Orlando, baptizing the dying Clarinda. And there's something erotic of this, right? Her armor is almost like negligee. We sort of have the prototype of the video game babe there, don't we? And there, again, there she is dying Clarinda dying of her wounds in an 18th century French portrait. There again, one breast bared, showing her femininity, but there's also something kind of salacious of this. Nudity can be very fraught. Nudity has a lot of meanings. Here we have sort of the sexy warrior woman. And what this all really merges together is in the story of La Maupin. Julie de Aubigny. Maupin was her married name. She was spuriously married to a nobleman named Maupin. But she was born to the secretary of the Count of Armagnac, who was also in charge of training the pages, so he received an excellent education, which would have involved, of course, riding and fencing. She's married to a well-off man, but she runs off with a fencing master. She runs off to the south of France, and they spend their time. They make some money by giving fencing shows, fencing exhibitions. And one case in her, one of the stories about her, she's challenged by some drunk guy in the audience. Oh, you couldn't actually be a woman. Women can't fight like that. And she rips her shirt off and says, "Oh yeah, really? Well, of course I can." So again, there we have that premise of the bared breast again, the proof of sex, or I should say, gender. Anyway, she gets tired of the fencing master. Takes up with a young woman, the daughter of a merchant, because she's also famously bisexual. And her dad puts her in a convent. She makes off with her and actually sets the convent on fire, making her escape. Ditches her, makes her way back to Paris. On the way, she wounds a young man in the shoulder when he hit on her while she was singing in a tavern, and he takes him as her lover. Goes and becomes an opera singer, which is of course a very, very salacious kind of job in late 17th, early 18th century. And famously also defeats 3 men in a duel who take exception to her monopolizing a young lady and kissing her, no less, during a ball. So we have here she's bisexual, she's deadly with the blade, and she's something of a virago, right? How much of this is true and how much of it is sensationalistic? Well, there's been no shortage of ink spilled over her. Interesting, by the way, she also portrayed Clarinda in Kemper's Tancred. Quite apropos. So here we have a woman who is with the sword, but there's a lot being made of her, right? And she's something that people are publishing about, because this idea of the armed woman, the dueling woman, it's become something fetishized. Let's move on. The sensationalist idea of dueling women continued through the 19th century. The only really known example of women dueling was actually two I believe, Austrian noblewomen dueling over flower arranging. This is proclaimed as a liberated duel because all the participants, the seconds, and even the surgeon, the doctor, because you have to have a doctor in attendance, were women. And they said, well, it's a matter of practicality. What we should do is we should take our shirts off. Why? Because this was commonly done in duels, because they knew about germ theory. And of course, there were no men in attendance. It was all women, so there were no men ogling them. But, so again, there's this trope, right, of the exposed breast that we're seeing over and over again. But this quickly, as we see, becomes sexualized. This was simply a matter of homosocial nudity, practical nudity, which then becomes fetishized. And we get quite a number of these Victorian Edwardian cheesecake postcards of semi-nude fencing or dueling women, obviously posed in photographer studios. Which brings us to the question, though, did women fence? This is sort of my last topic, women in fencing. Yes, they did. These are Professor Hartle's fencing women. They're from Vienna. They did a tour of the United States in the 19th century to much acclaim. And they're some of the people responsible for bringing fencing to the United States, obviously in early America, really up to the late 19th century, the Second Industrial Revolution. People didn't have much time or leisure or spare capital for frivolous or aristocratic pastimes like fencing, but here are these nice Viennese ladies coming and bringing weapons use to people. So, what about this? Well, one of the first, actually, references we have to women fencing actually comes from our oldest fact book, our earliest record of battle. This we see in Tower Manuscript 133, made in a cathedral school in Germany around 1325, a woman named Walpurgis, who offers us quite a number of techniques, which, by the way, beat all the other techniques. Who was she? Was she like some woman from the town, one of the fencing students' girlfriends? Because even though there were clerics and clerical orders, a lot of them still kind of cheated on their vows. Was she just a woman? Well, we can't there's really no way to tell from the manuscript. And Valise concludes, while Purgis's purpose as an antecedent remain unexplained, because there's nothing like her in any place, not even in Prudentius, but it's best concluded that she's a woman, not an allegory or an image of anything, who's wielding the sword simply to enjoy a good workout. She's, in other words, a woman who enjoyed fencing, so hey, let's put her in this book. Another early example of a woman fencer, Ana de Mendoza, princess, unfortunately died in prison, known as a famous beauty, all for even though she had one eye. How'd she lose the eye? Well, it might have been in a fall, but they put the story about that she lost it in a fencing accident at the age of 14. Arguably, because of women having to defend lots, women being, because of the conflict in Spain's past, and women having to defend towns and cities and other places in Spanish, over the history of Spain, women being allowed to wield weapons, as in the duel in Naples between the two women, may have been a little bit more allowable in Spanish culture. But I should mention that not all fencing women were born women. The Chevalier d'Eon was a famous transsexual. He had identified, or she, I should say, identified with women there. She is fencing the Chevalier de St. George. She was also a secret agent who infiltrated the imperial court of Russia as a woman. If she had been caught, she would, or exposed, she would have been, of course, she would have been executed. This is Ella Hatan La Jaguarina. She is another great example. She was, there's a lot of professional wrestling to her career, and the old fairground sort of professional wrestling, where they had these wrestling exhibitions. That's the origins of our modern televised professional wrestling. But she began in 1884, besides her vaudeville career, to defeat all challengers mounted on horseback with heavy, heavy sabers. She had a scar across her nose because one of these blows was so heavy it caved her mast in and gave her a cut. And she became a celebrity in frontier California. I mean, she was down in Southern California. She claimed to be half Mexican ancestry and learned knife fighting from gypsies and doing all sorts of things. And she died poor in obscurity in the early 20th century. She did her share of cheesecake about her too. But if she'd been born a little later, when fencing became more organized and formalized as a sport in the United States, she likely would have been a highly successful competitive fencer. Instead, she was kind of reduced to these vaudeville shows, again, trading on the novelty of a woman with a sword. But this sort of prize fighting wasn't uncommon in the West. And actually, one of Professor Hurdle's Valkyries, Matilda Yegeman, famously fought a man named Theodor Rosenberg, who had fought on the other side of the Austro-Prussian War, with sharp swords in Denver in 1889 on a $500 bet. And she beat him, by the way. She made him concede defeat. Whether or not these were staged, we don't know. Anyway, women's fencing started as a polite pastime for ladies. If you read old newspaper articles, it's like, oh no, it's very feminine, just like women in weight training, right? That, oh no, it won't make you a man. But there are quite a number of notable women fencers who were competitive athletes. Helene Mayer, who actually was Jewish and won Olympic gold several times till she had to leave Nazi Germany for being Jewish and came to the United States and then fenced for the United States. Much like the New School, it was Germany's loss and America's gain. But women still didn't compete in equal footing in fencing until 2004, because 2004 is the first time they actually allowed women's saber fencing in the Olympics. And there's no shortage of cheesecake around women fencing and advertising, etc. Easy to find. Why didn't they allow women to fence saber, by the way? Because it was too rough. They'll get bruised. Of course, sexism dies hard in fencing. Last note is that even today, we have these blurred lines between fiction and reality with female athletes. I'm going to give you two examples. On the left, that Ronda Rousey. She's not a fencer. She is both best known as a competitor in the UFC. She has like the most knockouts of the shortest time of anybody. Why? Because she was also an Olympic silver medalist in judo. But what she's best known for is she's pretty, right? This is the thing. She obviously has handlers. She can't just be a fantastic athlete, but she also has to be pretty. We have here this shirt of cheesecake. What this doesn't show you, because her nice long blonde hair is over here, she has an immense cauliflower ear from her judo training. And you know, this woman is a tremendously fierce and skilled competitor. But of course, even today, to make it in the world as a female athlete, you got to be pretty too. There's a huge double standard. On the right, Mariel Zakunis won 2 gold medals. What? In women's saber in the Olympics. Unfortunately, didn't do so well in the last Olympics, but she won in Beijing. I think it was 2014. But she won the first 2 women's Olympic saber medals. She's, again, I mean, I've seen this woman in action. I've been to clinics with her. I've watched her. I've spoken to her, and there she is wearing one of the for some years they're no longer allowed because they're not safe. You had these saber masks with these windows in them. Why? Because it has to be more médiagenique. Right? We got to make fencing more médiagenique for the cameras. And the thing is that Marielle, I'm not showing you a picture of her face because I'd rather see it as a competitor. She's very fit, but she's her best feature is her eyes, and you never see her without I don't know why. I mean, I never asked her, but without gobs, really big eye makeup, because she's got very pretty eyes, and it's really weird because in those masks you see her. She put her mask on, and what you see is these pair of very bright, very pretty eyes looking at you. That she just can't be taken on her own as a fantastic, incredible competitive athlete. But who won, don't forget, 2 Olympic gold medals. But also that we've got to have, there also has to be this bit of prettiness to her. And we see this again in pop culture images of women as swordspeople, swordspersons. Right? Game of Thrones, right? I mean, Xena warrior princess, right? I mean, Red Sonja, that's a classic depiction, right? That's the original chainmail bikini. Unrealistic proportions. And of course, you've got also the swordswomen as Virago, right? You've got Brienne from Game of Thrones. And then maybe you've got the criminal, right? You've got the Catalina, right? The lieutenant nun in Arya. We see these same tropes coming up over and over and over again. You've got these stereotypes that you really can't escape. But, and I'm not even going to talk about the various, sexy women, video game and comic book portrayals. But my point of it is this. If anything, women's roles were always constrained. When a woman picks up a sword, she is assuming a male role. And depending on the circumstances, this can have a variety of meanings. It could mean that there's an absence of male authority. There's an absence of men to fight for her. So she's forced to do it. It can mean that she is, in some sense, transgressive. She's going against the rules. And she's carving out something for herself. But there's also the danger that this is seen as somehow provocative, including sexually provocative, that by transgressing these values, that there might be something, even there's also something sexual of it, right? It's the infallist woman. And there's a lot to be said, there's a lot of literary criticism on that subject. And all of these things, all of these aspects, and you can't really separate the issue of power and enfranchisement from the sword, because the sword has always meant that. It means having control, it means having power. And we can and in a sense, the sexualized woman with the sword is a way of putting women neatly back into that box, or simply because such transgression has always been seen as something provocative. Anyway, that was my rundown of women in swords through history. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope there's... So, and of course, everything changed with time. So, I guess I'll turn the lights on, and if we have any questions or anything, we could talk about it. Buzz.
Yeah, do you ever find armor that was designed specifically for women?
Well, no, that's a big trope. The idea of female armor. Most likely, armor that was intended for women probably fit the same as for men because form really follows function as far as armor is concerned. Today, when we have women who want to who do armored combat, and I know many women who do armored combat, who do fighting and jousting and things like that. Usually, the same styles that work for men, but modified for their measurements, work best, and it was probably the same back in the day. We can see from the Joan of Arc portrait, she's essentially wearing male armor. The idea of boob armor is slightly ridiculous.
No, but obviously the hips are proportionally different in females. Female body size is smaller.
Mm-hmm. Well, men weren't really huge back in the day either. But
no,
yeah.
but proportionally, sexual dimorphism has existed for probably a million years.
But men come in many different sizes too, and armorers can. Armorers always made armor to fit the individual. You had stuff off the rack, of course, but if you're a woman who can afford armor, you're in a position to do that. You're probably you're having it made for you. Of course, it depends on the armor too. I mean, chainmail doesn't really need to be tailored. It's easily tailored, and it's also somewhat more flexible. If you've got plate armor, that needs to be tailored a bit more, but it's not. It's not so difficult to put a woman in men's armor. It's more important that the general proportions too. Because don't forget, also armor shapes your body. Like any costume shapes your body. I look like I have a different body type when I wear my armor, and also I look like I have a different body type depending on which armor I wear. And so actually don't forget also with the medieval silhouette. Women have more hips, but then you usually have mail or a fall, something flexible over your hips. But a large chest was actually part of the 14th, 15th century silhouette.
So what you're saying is that there's no armor that you can attribute to exclusively being a female armor?
No, there's no surviving examples of women armor attributable to women. No. Yeah. Anyone else have any other questions?
Elizabeth I of England must have had armour because there is reference when she makes a speech to the troops at Tilbury.
Right.
She's described as wearing armour, but I think they say that the armour she wears is the armour of an Amazon, and I can't quite remember the reference. I think it might, but that might have been on a different occasion.
Yeah, Elizabeth I famously did wear armour, but in the Renaissance there was this entire genre form of costume armor. The Negroli family in Milan got very rich making this stuff for people. So this may have been a sort of costume armor or dress armor.
Yeah, well, it was more when the troops were waiting in Tilbury, expecting the Armada to arrive, and she went down on horseback and spoke to her troops as their commander. As their commander,
right? Wearing armor, she was dressing the part.
Yes, and she's described as wearing armor.
So this is armor as costume.
Yeah.
Right? This is armor as costume.
Yes, but she does it in the speech. She makes it very clear that she's doing this in the identity of sort of masculine general.
Right, and that's part of Elizabeth's big propaganda of her reign. Mm-hmm. But this is also political propaganda.
Oh yeah.
And by costume, I don't mean that it's fake or something.
Mm-hmm.
I mean that armor is always a form of costume because you're playing the role of the enfranchised man. And certainly this is something that Elizabeth did. Mm-hmm. And this was probably made by the Royal Armories in Greenwich to her measurements. Mm-hmm. And again, it was a bit of her propaganda. Mm-hmm. And this was something that you frequently see in Renaissance rulers, that they frequently have Renaissance armor, that they have these sorts of costume armors made for them. Mm-hmm. Stuff that would never work in battle. Fantastically embossed and engraved, incredible stuff. It's sculpture, essentially. It's beautiful, full of classical allegories and references. And certainly she's referencing, reference Amazons, and that would be natural. Mm-hmm. But would those actually ride into battle? No. But she did have the Ascension Day tilts. She had the men who vying for her favor, jousting, vying for her favor. Mm-hmm. It was a huge part of her propaganda program. Any other questions?
I was thinking about that ivory box in the cloisters. Do you know that one?
Mm-hmm.
With the
Several.
with the one that shows the assault on the castle of love,
Mm-hmm.
and the women are defending with flowers.
Mm-hmm.
Not very effectively by the look of it.
No, well,
But
who wants to hold their castle?
They were wanting it, wanting to lose, but.
Well, if you hold your castle of love, too tightly, you'll never get married. But it was a common trope, particularly in tournaments, courtly love literature. This whole idea of the castle of love. But you can see, I think, where this comes from with women's very real role in holding, especially if the woman was in command, would hold the town, hold the fortress, hold the castle. All right, cool. Well, thank you all very much, and I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this was somewhat edifying.
Thank you.